There are moments in war when silence is not peace, but a warning. The kind of stillness that settles right before chaos speaks again. In a makeshift field dressing station on the outskirts of Cannes in June 1944, that silence hangs thick as smoke. A single nurse stands alone in the dim, flickering light. One woman for nearly 400 wounded men, each of them waiting, trembling, fading, or screaming inside their own skulls. The air tastes of iron. Bandage rolls stick to her palms from dried blood. Outside, artillery still echoes, each rumble folding into the next, like distant thunder refusing to die. She was never trained for this. Medical school taught anatomy, sutures, clean linens. Not the stench of ruptured flesh. Not the sound a man makes when he's trying not to cry because the boy next to him is younger than his little brother. And certainly not the rule whispered to her by a surgeon 2 nights earlier. Choose right, and you save a life. Choose wrong, and he will die right in front of you. Her boots step into puddles of water mixed with something darker. Every cot looks the same from a distance. Torn clothes, pale faces, shaky breaths. Yet each one holds a different question. Who is next? Who can wait? Who won't last the next 10 minutes? She scans for rising chests, shallow breathing, hidden bleeding. She knows, terrifyingly, that she must make choices faster than her conscience can understand them. Behind her, a soldier with half a bandage around his torso reaches out, fingers curling weakly around the hem of her coat. Another man near the far wall begs for water. A third whispers a prayer in a language she doesn't know. The room is full of motion, but still rooted in that suffocating silence. The silence of decisions, of triage, of unbearable responsibility. She closes her eyes for half a second, drawing courage from somewhere she didn't know existed. Then she opens them and moves. The silence breaks. The night begins, and history shifts the smallest, almost invisible amount toward one idea that will save hundreds of men who are still breathing only because she has not yet stopped. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? She learned the truth by accident. An ugly, hidden truth buried beneath the noise of battle reports and heroic headlines. Not all soldiers in World War II died from bullets, shrapnel, or collapsing trenches. A staggering number, some field studies estimated nearly 70%, died because of mistakes made after the fighting stopped. Bandages wrapped too tightly, cloth placed in the wrong spot, wounds covered without marking where the real danger was, arms that looked stable on the outside but bled silently on the inside, legs that were constricted so harshly the tissue began dying before the medics even saw them. No one taught this in training. In calm hospitals far from the front, instructors emphasized cleanliness, precision, hygiene. Out here, none of that mattered if the first wrap on a wound was wrong. A bad bandage could kill faster than a bullet, and most of the men lying on stretchers didn't even realize it. The nurse noticed it on her 3rd week in Normandy. A soldier brought in from the hedgerows had a simple cloth tied around his thigh. It looked harmless, almost neat. But beneath it, the bleeding had pooled inside, hidden under pressure, creeping upward like a shadow. By the time the doctor reached him, his pulse was a thread. He died with his eyes still open, as if waiting for someone to say it wasn't his fault. She stared at that bandage for a long time after they carried him out. It was a good knot, clean fabric, a textbook wrap, and it had killed him. That night, surrounded by lanterns burning low and water basins stained pink, she made herself a promise. No more silent mistakes. Not if she could prevent them. Not if her hands could send a signal before her voice even reached the doorway. She began experimenting, loosening some wrappings, tightening others, marking certain spots with small knots, twists, or folds. At first, they looked like nothing, sloppy work. A tired nurse in too many layers of smoke and chaos. But patterns began to form. A diagonal twist meant internal bleeding suspected. A loose fold meant don't cut here. A triple wrap meant urgent, no time to talk. She didn't call it a system. She didn't dare call it innovation. She just grumbled to herself one evening, exhausted beyond language. It's just a stupid little trick, but maybe it'll stop the next guy from dying. She had no idea it would save hundreds. By the fourth week, the war burned hotter than any of them expected. Supply lines choked, storms tore through transport routes, and one by one, the lifelines of a field dressing station disappeared. The morphine ran out first, its last vial used on a man whose leg had shattered under tank treads. Then the anesthetics vanished, reduced to empty metal tins rattling uselessly in a drawer. The antibiotics followed, snatched up faster than they could be replaced. Even the sutures, simple thread and needle, became precious enough to measure like gold. In Normandy, in Sicily, on the black volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the story was the same. Medics were left with nothing but gauze, water boiled over campfires, and their own raw endurance. A terrible equation formed. Hundreds of wounded, almost no tools, and time that refused to slow down. The nurse understood what this meant. Without medication to dull pain, every movement she made became agony for someone. Without proper clotting agents, she could only press her palms onto wounds and pray the bleeding would ease. Without stitches, she had to improvise closures with strips of torn uniforms, safety pins, or even thin lengths of wire scavenged from broken radio sets. It was medicine reduced to its bones, primitive, frantic, but still desperately hopeful. In that desperation, her stupid bandage trick became something more than a habit. It became a language. Doctors rushing into the station didn't have time to ask for explanations. The air was too thick with smoke and groans. The corridors were too narrow, the stretchers too many. She needed a way to tell them immediately who was dying now, who could wait 10 minutes, who had a hidden wound they might miss. So she shaped the cloth to speak for her. A tight spiral over the ribs meant suspected puncture. A knotted corner near the shoulder meant check for fragments. A small flap left intentionally open meant prepare for internal bleed. Her hands moved faster each day, guided by instinct growing sharper under pressure. She didn't write any of it down. There was no time, no paper, no certainty she'd even survive long enough to organize her thoughts. Yet the doctors started noticing. "What's this twist?" one muttered during a chaotic evening triage. "Why is this wrap double-looped?" another asked. But before she could answer, they saw for themselves. The pattern matched the injury. Her cloth was speaking before her voice could. And in a world without medicine, that small miracle was sometimes the only thing that kept a soldier breathing long enough to see dawn. It happened in less than 30 seconds, quick enough to be forgotten, but sharp enough to carve a scar into her mind forever. Two soldiers were carried in from the same collapsed trench, both covered in dust, both missing boots, both shaking with shock so violently their stretchers rattled. In the chaos, she wrapped their bandages in nearly identical patterns. A simple oversight, a moment of hurry, a blur of movement in a night filled with far too much red. The first man had a clear leg wound, bleeding but manageable. The second looked similar, until she touched his abdomen and felt the lethal rigidity beneath his skin. Internal bleeding, the invisible killer of war. A race against time, where every heartbeat was a countdown. But when the surgeons burst into the tent, scanning for her signals, the two men looked the same. Same dirt-streaked faces, same blood on their uniforms, same bandage wraps. One doctor grabbed the first stretcher without hesitation, believing he was the one at greatest risk. The nurse tried to shout over the noise, but her voice drowned beneath the thundering boots, the clatter of metal trays, the suffocating storm of commands and cries. 12 minutes passed before anyone realized the mistake. 12 minutes in a war where a man could lose half his blood in half that time. When they finally reached the second soldier, his pulse was barely a whisper. His skin had gone gray, his breathing thin and fluttering. A medic pressed his fingers against the man's throat and looked up with eyes that said what no one wanted to say. He was too far gone. They worked anyway, because that's what medical staff do. They fight even when the battle is already lost. But deep down, everyone in the room knew those 12 minutes had been the difference between life and death. She stood motionless afterward, her gloves sticky with blood, staring at the two bandages that matched each other like cruel reflections. Her chest tightened with something cold and heavy, a feeling that wasn't grief, not exactly, more like shame laced with fury, at herself, at the chaos, at the impossible decisions she had to make with trembling hands and a breaking heart. That night, she tore apart every roll of bandage she could find. She twisted them, folded them, knotted them, forced them into shapes that could never be confused again. She would never let two wounded men look identical under her care. Not ever. From that moment, the stupid bandage trick was no longer just survival. It became her rebellion against the randomness of death. Because on a battlefield where a wrong wrap could end a life, a single intentional mark could return an entire future. By the time autumn crept across the front, her hands had become both her greatest weapon and her deepest fear. They shook now, not constantly, but often enough that she noticed. A tremor born not of weakness, but of the human body realizing it had seen too much too quickly. She was 22 years old. In another life, she might have been studying pediatrics or assisting in a quiet clinic. Instead, she was elbow deep in the wounds of strangers, making decisions that seasoned officers struggled to live with. The tremor first appeared when she unwrapped a bandage from a soldier's chest and saw the wound open like a second mouth, raw, jagged, and pulsing faintly with every inhale. Her fingers fluttered in hesitation. The soldier noticed. He whispered something, meant to reassure her, not the other way around. That was the part that broke her. A dying man comforting the person trying to save him. Hours later, when she stepped outside into the cold air, she looked at her hands under the lantern light. They were still shaking. She pressed them against her own ribs, hoping the tremor would quiet. It didn't. But here's where the story deepens. Those trembling hands still worked. They wrapped signals onto wounds even when she felt she might faint. They tightened cloth around shattered limbs while her heart pounded like artillery. They pressed onto bleeding arteries with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Every shake was a reminder of fear, yet every completed bandage was proof that fear didn't own her. Other medics began imitating her markings, even if they didn't fully understand them. "Do whatever she's doing," one surgeon muttered during a frantic midnight rush. "It works." And so the language she'd created in desperation became a shared code, passed through whispers, glances, and hurried gestures above the injured. Sometimes she wondered whether she truly deserved that trust. Sometimes she asked herself a question she never voiced. How can hands that tremble still save a life? But the battlefield offered its own answer, wordless, brutal, undeniable. Every time a soldier opened his eyes after surgery, Every time a pulse steadied after treatment, every time a stretcher left the tent with one more chance at survival, her trembling hands were part of that miracle. So let me ask you, the viewer, do you think courage means having steady hands, or using trembling ones anyway? Hunger does strange things to men. It strips away rank, accent, and bravado until only the most basic truth remains. Everyone wants to live. By winter, the field stations stretched across France and the Pacific had begun rationing food so tightly that even the medics felt their stomachs claw at them. A soldier with a bandage across his ribs once apologized to her for eating too slowly because he wanted to savor the taste of stale bread. Another kept half a biscuit in his pocket, not to eat, but to remind himself that tomorrow was worth reaching. Inside that harsh world, something unexpected happened. Her bandages became more than warnings or codes. They became signals of hope, tiny beacons stitched into cloth and sweat. One afternoon, she leaned over a young man whose uniform still smelled of sea salt from a landing craft. He was delirious with fever, whispering nonsense, drifting in and out of consciousness. As she wrapped the bandage across his arm with the distinct double loop that meant immediate priority, his eyes suddenly sharpened. He stared at the markings, then at her, and in a hoarse whisper he said, I know that one. That means I'm not done yet." Some soldiers began searching each other's bandages like scouts reading secret messages. A diagonal wrap meant they still had time. A loose tail of cloth meant a surgeon had already been notified. A tight cross symbol under the ribs meant stay awake. Someone is watching for you. Even the dying clung to these symbols. One man, clutching a blood-soaked strip she had tied minutes earlier, murmured that it felt like holding a lighthouse in a storm. Over time, her system spread far beyond her station. Medics passing through copied the patterns. Some drew them on scrap paper. Others memorized the shapes. Soon, soldiers joked that she had invented a new language of survival, and if you could read it, you had a better chance than most. But survival wasn't just medical, it was emotional. On nights when the camp grew unbearably quiet, the kind of quiet that made men fear the next morning, she sometimes found crumpled letters left on the cots, notes from soldiers thanking her, not for the bandage, but for the message hidden inside it. Somebody hasn't given up on me. And now I want to ask you directly, because stories like this live on only if people choose to carry them. If you were lying on that stretcher, bleeding, terrified, half-starved, would a small symbol of hope matter to you? Would you hold on to it? Your answer tells more about human nature than any textbook ever could. Dawn came without warmth. A thin, gray light seeped through the canvas walls of the station, revealing the outlines of exhausted bodies, overturned basins, and the ghostly shimmer of dried blood on the floorboards. For the first time in weeks, the shelling had stopped. No distant thunder, no metallic clatter, just a fragile stillness that felt almost unnatural. Men who could move lifted their heads, confused by the quiet. Those who couldn't blinked into the pale light, unsure whether they were waking in the same world they had fallen asleep in. Then the order arrived. It came as a short, clipped message, delivered by a courier whose uniform was soaked from the night's freezing rain. A transfer. All stretcher-ready patients were to be moved to a transport convoy before the next storm made the roads impassable. The nurse stared at the paper in her hand, feeling the weight of what it meant. This morning, this ordinary, cold, smoky morning, might be the last time she ever saw most of these men. Suddenly, the station erupted with motion. Medics scrambled to check pulses, tighten wrappings, reheat whatever thin broth could be made on short notice. Soldiers who could stand helped carry those who couldn't. The nurse moved through the chaos with practiced urgency, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just bandaging bodies anymore. She was saying goodbye with her hands. At one cut, she rewrapped a shoulder with the diagonal mark she had invented. The man beneath it squeezed her wrist gently, not with fear, but with gratitude. At another, she tightened a double loop and whispered, "This one keeps you at the front of the line." A third soldier, so young he still had freckles, showed her a blood-stained strip he had kept tucked in his pocket like a charm. "Lucky piece," he said, forcing a grin. She didn't have the heart to tell him it was just a scrap. In his eyes, it was a promise. Outside, fog rolled across the open field. The convoy engines hummed low, waiting. Medics lifted the wounded one by one, placing them onto trucks where muffled groans blended with the clatter of metal rails. Each time one left, she felt a small ache, an invisible thread snapping quietly inside her chest. And then, a moment she never expected, a surgeon approached her with a handful of bandages tied in her patterns. "We're taking these with us," he said simply. No recognition, no ceremony, just the quiet admission that her invention had become essential. When the last truck pulled away, disappearing into the mist like a long, fragile hope carried toward an uncertain horizon, she stood alone in the silence once more. Not the terrifying silence from her first night, a different one. A silence shaped by survival, by loss, by something she could not name. 400 men would live because of her hands, yet not a single report would mention her name. And that, perhaps, is the truest portrait of wartime medicine. Lives saved in shadows, heroism recorded nowhere, and a legacy carried only in the hearts of those who survived long enough to remember. History often remembers the battles, the generals, the dates carved into monuments, but it rarely remembers the quiet breath between heartbeats where survival is decided. It rarely remembers the trembling hands of a young nurse who stood in a dim tent with nothing but cloth, instinct, and a will so fierce it refused to let darkness swallow the men laid before her. Yet her presence lingers in every life that continued because she shaped a strip of bandage with meaning. In every family that grew because a father or brother returned home when statistics said he should not have. As the years drifted on, long after the guns fell silent and the battlefields were reclaimed by grass and wind, those men aged. They carried grandchildren on their shoulders, planted gardens behind small houses, fixed leaky roofs, argued with neighbors, and told half-forgotten stories over dinner tables. Somewhere among them, perhaps without knowing why, a few kept pieces of cloth tucked in drawers or photo albums. Others remembered the markings without recalling who made them, only that someone had cared enough to send a message through folded gauze. Hold on. Someone is fighting for you. Time softened their scars, but memory never fully released its grip. Even decades later, an old soldier might close his eyes on a quiet night and see again the glow of lanterns in a medical tent, hear the low murmur of medics moving through rows of wounded, or feel the faint pressure of a bandage that told him he still had a chance. These moments, fragile and dim, are threads weaving their way through history, unseen but unbroken. And somewhere, in the unrecorded corners of wartime archives, her story remains, without rank, without ceremony, without the medal that should have shone on her uniform. Yet her legacy lives in something far more enduring. The lives she touched, the future she restored, the silent victories she won with nothing but determination and cloth. In the end, it is often the unnamed who shape the world most gently and most profoundly, leaving behind ripples that reach further than any headline.